Hello. Today is Thursday. I would normally do this on Wednesday, but just a lot of stuff happened yesterday. And just to be honest with you, sometimes it takes a little motivation on my part to move forward with this study, only because I don't get any energy feedback. And so if I am low, it's really hard for me to do this. And so I put it off until today, and I apologize for the delay in the Wednesday class and the fact that I'm taping it or filming it on Thursday. I apologize. I don't know how often this will happen, but might happen again. And so just be aware of that. And it has a lot to do with my mood and what's going on here at the property. I had a little flooding yesterday, and that kind of distracted me also. So those are all my excuses. Welcome. I'm glad you're here to listen to our third lesson from Judges, or our third class. And before I go any farther, let me open with some prayer. And I think I have neglected to do that over the last two lessons, and I apologize to my class. I know that you always remind me of this, usually at the class, and you're not here to remind me, and so I have to remember. And you all know how my memory is sometimes. So let us pray. Most gracious and loving God, we thank you for the opportunity to come together today. Although we're not physically present with each other, we are spiritually present together today to study your word. Watch over us, guide us through your word, give us wisdom and insight to understand what we're reading today and how it makes sense and applies in our life today. And through all of this, we thank you for the Son that you gifted to us to redeem us from our sins and to lead us into new life. Amen. Okay. Today we're going to be looking at the third chapter of Judges, verses 7 through 31. So it's the rest of chapter 3 of the book of Judges. Okay, so again, just to kind of reiterate and bring us up to date as to where we are in the story, or in the presentation of the stories. The first lesson was on our first prologue, and last week's lesson was on the second prologue, which sets us up for the stories that are beginning today. Today we're actually going to start looking at some judges. There are 3 judges in our story today. And again, I remind you that Judges is in 3 cycles. There are 3 sets and 3 judges in each set. So altogether there are 9 judges. And today we're going to look at the first of those 3 judges from the very first set. Now here's what one of the other things you need to see about this is that we have met this very first character already. This is Othniel that we're going to talk about today. At first, he's the first judge up on our list. And Othniel, if you remember, is the nephew of Caleb. And so this is Caleb's nephew and also his son-in-law, as in Caleb's daughter was given to Othniel when he was victorious in capturing a city. And that was in our very first lesson. They kind of give us an overview. And here we have now the story of Othniel and how he became a judge and judged wisely in through God. As we progress through the story, you will see that God gets further and further away from the judges, from how they interact with God and how God interacts with them. And it slowly, progressively gets worse as we move through the story. Okay, so beginning with Judges chapter 3, verse 7. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God, and worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites who delivered them. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram into his hand. And his hand prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim, so the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So as we begin our story, and what we'll find is in each cycle, or as each judge is introduced, we have this opening phrase. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And what was evil in the sight of the Lord that they're doing is they forgot the Lord their God. That doesn't mean they forgot about him, that they erased him from their memory. What it means is they forgot to continue to worship God. They still recognized God. They still realized God was out there, that Yahweh, this particular God that they were supposed to follow, Adonai, was out there in the world, was out there in the realms, but they did not worship him. Instead, they worshipped and started worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. That's my dog. She's scratching in the background, and that's her collar stuff. Please stop that. Please be quiet. Thank you. Okay, so the people had started worshiping and had fallen for the Canaanite gods, the Baals and the Asherahs. So God got angry about this. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. So what it says is that God sold them into slavery, sold them into servanthood under this king, under this Cushan fellow. And for 8 years they were under the yoke of Cushan Rishathaim. And after 8 years they began to cry out. Maybe they remembered Adonai, they remembered Yahweh, and they started crying out to Yahweh again, remembering their childhood God, the God of their fathers, the God of their mothers. And so they remembered, and they started crying out to the Lord, to Yahweh. And Yahweh raised up a deliverer for Israelites, and he delivered them. This is a phrase we hear that God raised up. God raised up somebody. What that means is that he lifted them out of the crowd and made them a hero, a leader, a man of importance, somebody of importance. Not necessarily a man, as we will see as we move forward, that sometimes it's women. That, in fact, I honestly think that the women were mostly written out of the story, and God spoke to women more often than men, because women maybe probably listen better than us men. Anyway, that's me just rambling again. But for 8 years they were under the oppression of this Cushan Rishathaim, and they started crying out to Yahweh, to Adonai, and Adonai raises up a deliverer. And we find out that the deliverer is Othniel, the son of Kenan, who was the brother of Caleb. And we've discussed Caleb many times. Caleb is a hero from the Old Testament. He's a hero from the book of Exodus all the way up through to today. Caleb was a hero. And so this is the son of his younger brother, his nephew, who has lifted up the mantle of leadership for the... Now remember, this is in the tribe of Judah. Caleb was from the tribe of Judah, and so Judah is the one that lifts up first. And as we move through our stories, again, I'll remind you that we'll move from the south to the north. We start in Judah, and then the next story, the next judge that's raised up is Ehud, and he is from the tribe of Benjamin. So as we move forward, we'll see also that the stories move north until we started Judah, way down in south with Othniel, and we will end all the way up in Dan. And so this is the who was raised up. And what it says is, I remind you that he was raised up to deliver, a deliverer for the Israelites, and he delivered them. And it says that the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him. Now that is a phrase we see not frequently, but many times in our Old Testament, that God actually moves his Spirit into somebody. That we see that with Saul, that God infused his Spirit into Saul, and for a while Saul, the king Saul, the one who was the predecessor to David, had God's Spirit in him. And in fact, there's a story where God's Spirit leaves Saul, and the hole that is left is filled with a spirit of a troubling spirit, which causes Saul to have all kinds of mental issues. And that spirit leaves Saul and settles on David. And we see that in the book of Samuel, or in the books of Samuel, that both of those, that whole story comes out of Samuel. And so this is the Spirit of God as it moves in, and it comes upon him, and he judged Israel. Now that means that he would have stood at the gate or under a tree and provided judgment. And so it says he judged Israel. It doesn't tell us how he did that, but it does say he judged Israel. And he went out to war, which makes him a war chief. Again, just like Joshua was. Now Othniel, the son, the nephew of Caleb, is the war chief for the tribe of Judah. And he goes out and they rebel against this Cushan Rashathaim, and they prevail over him. And he's given into the hand of Othniel. And so Othniel wins the war. And it ends with the land had rest for 40 years. And then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. And so for the rest of Othniel's life, as long as he was alive, God had settled peace over the people. Because Othniel followed God, and he listened to God, and he did as God instructed him. That's what we are to understand from the story of Othniel. In every way, Othniel is the prime example of how they are supposed to act, how they're supposed to be. And now let's compare, and we'll see as we move forward how far and how further and further away the people, the judges, drift from the example set by Othniel, where he hears God, he stands up, and the Spirit of God fills him so that he does the will of God in the world. So, now we move forward to the story of Ehud. And so we pick up with chapter 3, verse 12. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Amorites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. Okay, so in our second part of this, as we begin the next story, the story of Ehud, this is verses 12 through 14. Again, we begin with the phrase, and we'll see this often. We'll see this 7 more times after this. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. I think actually there'll be 8 more times, because there's one at the very end of the book of Judges. And the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab. So King Eglon was the king of the Moabites. Now, just to remind you of a little history here, the Moabites are from, they're the children of Moab, and Moab was the son of Lot. And that was all part of, they were the son of Lot, who is, of course, Abraham's nephew. And so these are the descendants of Moab who are, at this time, are standing against Israel, unfortunately for them. And the king of the Moabites, King Eglon, because Israel was not following God, and again they had forgotten about God and were worshiping Baals and Asherahs. Maybe during Othniel's time they had drifted back to God, back to Yahweh, and now Othniel's dead. And so they again go back to doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And because they were doing this, God allowed King Moab to come in, along with the Ammonites and the Amalekites. And again, the the Ammonites are a distant relative also of the Israelites. I'd have to go back and trace it, but I do remember that they are a distant relative. They're the sons of Ammon. And I'll have to go back and find that. It's not important to our story, other than they're also a distant relative tribal unit that have aligned themselves with Moab, another distant tribal relative, and they come out and they defeat the Israelite people. And they take possession of the city of palms. The city of palms is Jericho, and so... although, and here's what's kind of an interesting little twist in all of this. I want you to remember that when Jericho was destroyed, a curse was laid on the land where Jericho was. It was laid on that city, the destruction of that city, that it would never be reborn again, that it would never be rebuilt. And in fact, if it was rebuilt, it would cost the lives of 2 sons. And as we move forward way into the future, Jericho is rebuilt, and there's a description of how that happens, and the 2 sons that actually die during the story and are laid at the gates of the city. But that's, again, a different story. So they take possession of what is the rebuilt Jericho, if you will, or at least the region where Jericho was. And the Israelites are put under bondage for 18 years. They end up serving King Eglon. Take a break here for just a second. Picking up now with verse 15 of chapter 3. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera the Benjamite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, Silence. And all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber, and said, I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, so he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him and locked them. Okay, this is an interesting story, and there is a lot of wordplay involved in all of this. So let's move through this because there's actually some humor in this. It's some dark humor, but there's some humor in this. So again, they're under the influence of, or they're under the bondage of King Eglon, and this is 18 years along, and finally the Israelites cry out again to Yahweh, and Yahweh raises up a deliverer. And his name is Ehud, and he is the son of Gera the Benjamite. a left-handed man. Now, this is really kind of interesting, is that the Benjamites are known for being left-handed, and yet Benjamin means son of my right hand. Isn't that fun? Benjamin means son of my right hand, and yet there is many instances throughout the Scripture, especially, again, when we get toward the end as we move further into Judges, and as things happen, we find out that the Benjamites are predominantly a left-handed tribe, that a lot of the men are left-handed. And so it is just kind of an interesting little thing that the son of my right hand is mostly left-handed people. But this left-handedness also plays into the story in an interesting way, is because he hides the sword. Well, let's move forward here with the story. And so the Israelites then, and I'm sure that Ehud arranged this because he's the one that's being raised up, but he's chosen to bring tribute to King Ehud. And so he's the one who's bringing the monthly or the weekly or the however often they have to bring the tribute to Ehud. He's the one that's selected, and he bring the tribute. And he makes for himself a sword with two edges. Now, what's interesting, a double-edged sword like this, in the Hebrew, when you speak of a double-edged sword, what it means, the actual literal translation is that he made himself a sword with two mouths. That because the sword speaks from both sides. The sword is often, throughout Scripture, in Old Testament and even more so in New Testament under Paul's writing, we find that the sword comes from the mouth. The sword is the tongue, or the sword is what, it comes from the mouth. And so it is interesting to me, and this is part of the humor in this, is that the sword has two edges, the sword has two mouths. And as the story progresses, Ehud uses this concept, or the story uses the concept of the two mouths in how it presents the story. Remember, he comes. He has the sword fastened on his right thigh. Now, normally, a right-handed person, you'd put it on your left thigh, and people would be looking for that. And so that he has it on his right side over here and kind of hidden under his cloak means that the guards would not see it. They wouldn't even look for it because they would be looking to the left side for where the sword should be, because most men most people are right-handed. Using the left hand in this culture is also considered unclean. And so these left-handed people are difficult to fit into culture because their left-handedness is also considered a sign of uncleanliness. And that's because the left hand is used for what King Ehud is doing in the cool chamber. And we'll get to that part of this. Ehud brings the tribute to King Eglon of Moab, and we find out now that Eglon was a very large man. He was a fat man. I mean, it's a very fat man is how it's described in our Scripture. So he's a large man. And Ehud brings in the tribute, and he presents it to the king, presents it to Eglon, and then he sends all of the servants that were helping Ehud bring in the treasure. They all leave. They all get dismissed. And as Ehud then turns and he starts to head away, and he gets as far as what they call the stones near Gilgal. And at that point, he turns around and he lets the king know that he has a secret message for him. Now, here again is the idea of the words coming out. He's a message for the king, and the message is the words coming out from the mouth is actually the hidden sword. And so he's not again. Here is the play on words that we have throughout all of this. Is the two-edged sword and Ehud speaking, saying he has a message. And so the king sends out everybody, says silence, and he sends everybody out. And so all of his attendants leave, and it's just Ehud and it's just Ehud and Eglon, and we find out that Ehud comes to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. The cool roof chamber would have been his privy. There would have been a chamber pot in there and a nice, cool, comfortable place for him to sit. It would have been up on the rooftop and so forth. And so that's where Eglon is. He's in his privy. He's in his bathroom. And that's where Ehud comes to him. And he says, I have a message for you from God. Here again is the word coming out of the mouth. I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. So Eglon starts to stand up, or he stands up, and Ehud reaches out with his left hand. He takes the sword, which would have been a complete surprise to King Eglon, and he jams it into his belly. And he is so fat that the blade, now it says it's a cubit long, and a cubit, it's a cubit in length. That's 18 inches. So this is a very large man, and he gets stabbed with an 18-inch blade, and it goes all the way not only to the hilt, but the large roll that this man has also even covers up the hilt of the sword. And Ehud just leaves the sword there. And the hilt also went in after the blade. I'm reading again, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Now that phrase means that he let his bowels loose. This is a very polite way. The dirt came out means that his bowels opened up, and so that plays into the story as we move forward. And so then Ehud, he leaves out of the place, and he closes the door to the roof chamber, leaving King Eglon in there, and he locks the door. He locks the door, and he walks away. So he goes out a different entrance, and he closes the door, and he locks it behind himself, and he leaves. Okay, picking up now with verse 24. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. There was their Lord lying dead on the floor. So here's where we fully understand what's going on, or we get a little bit more of the picture. So Ehud leaves Eglon there in the cool chamber, and after he left, the servants came back. Of course, maybe a little bit of time came, but they came back and they checked the door and they see that it was locked. And they thought, well, he must be in there relieving himself. Maybe the smell had come through, because remember that Eglon his bowels had been loosed, and so maybe they smelled it a little bit, and they said, he must be using the chamber. We'll just leave him alone for now. And so they waited until the point where they were embarrassed for the king on how long he was in the bathroom, how long he was in that cool chamber. So they waited until it came to a point of embarrassment to them, that they needed to actually interrupt the king while he's sitting in his cool room here, while he's sitting on this throne. A little humor for myself. Anyway. When he still did not open the door of the roof chamber, they came in, they took the key, and they opened the doors, and they found him lying there, dead on the floor. Picking up now with verse 24. Verse 26. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and passed beyond the sculptured stones, and escaped to Sirah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head. He said to them, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they killed about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. No one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years. Okay. So while the servants are all there standing at the door of the cool chamber, Ehud makes his escape, and he gets beyond the sculptured stone and he escapes to Seirah. Now we're not sure where these sculptured stones are in relationship to where he's at. This is a little bit of we don't know. These could be where they had placed idols along the way, or they could be just marker stones. They could be just decorative. We don't know. But he gets past those and he escapes to a nearby town. And when he arrives there, they sound the shofar, which is the call to war. And he does that in the hill country of Ephraim. And again, that's one of the sons of Joseph. We have Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Ephraim here is the larger or the more important of the two tribes between Ephraim and Manasseh. And Benjamin, which is where Ehud is from, remember that, he's from Benjamin. He calls on Ephraim to come and help. Now remember that Joseph and Benjamin were full brothers. Just like Judah and Simon were full brothers, and Simon was kind of absorbed into Judah. Here we have Benjamin, the younger brother, calling on the older brother Joseph to come and help us in the war, in this battle against the Moabites. And Ephraim answers the call. They go down. Now we note here that they're called the Israelites. Usually whenever we mention Ephraim, Manasseh, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali. I've left a couple out, I know I have. But if you've mentioned any of those, you're talking about the northern kingdom, which later becomes the northern kingdom. But the northern area, the northern territory, is known, the 10 tribes that live up in the northern territory are known as, over the period of time that we're talking about, the territory is known as Israel. It's known as Ephraim for a period of time. It was known as Ephraim. It was also known as Samaria. And so we have 3 names for that northern territory. At least 3 names. And we may run across more as we move forward, but at that moment, those are the ones that come to my mind. And so Ephraim joins in the fight, and they go out and with Ehud as the head, so Benjamin leading the way, and the tribe of Ephraim, the tribes of Joseph, right behind, being led by Benjamin. And so he says to them, "Follow after me, for Yahweh has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." And so, now I want you to remember that at the beginning of the story here, we find out that Ehud is called up by God, but it doesn't say that God filled him with the Spirit, with his Spirit. All it says is that God raised him up. And then God isn't mentioned again, other than I have a message for you from God. And so Ehud has a connection with God. It is less than Othniel's, but it is not much less, but it is slightly less of a relationship than Othniel has. And so, but he calls on the Ephraimites to come to the battle, and they join forces following them, following Ehud, understanding that he's being led by God. "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands." So they go down with him, and they seize the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites. Remember, the Moabites are actually in the northeastern area across the Jordan. And so the Moabites have actually crossed the Jordan and beaten up Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. And so now they're pushing back across the Jordan, and they push them back into their own territory again. And they didn't allow them to come back. And so, actually, they kind of they're ahead of them, and they wipe them out as they're coming to the Jordan. The the warriors following Ehud kill about 10,000, the Moabites, not allowing them to cross back into Moabite territory. And no one escaped their wrath or their destruction. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, under the hand of Ephraim and Benjamin, and the land had rest for 80 years. Now that's twice as long as under Othniel, over 80 years. And I want you to know also, as we move forward, this is the longest stretch of peace that Israel had during this period of time. That 80-year stretch during the time of Judges, that's the longest stretch of peace they have. Okay, our final king, our final judge, and it's almost a letdown, but here it is. And we will find in this last one here that God doesn't really come into the story at all. After him came Shamgar, son of Anath. This is verse 31. After him came Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He too delivered Israel. So our final judge is Shamgar, and he's the son of Anath, and he kills 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Now an ox goad is like a cattle prod. It's got a long spike on the end. It's just a big stick it's just a stick with a prod on the end. And with that, he kills 600 Philistines. And he also delivers Israel from the Philistines, who maybe had moved into the territory. Philistines are newcomers to this region, and so we don't have much about this story. That's as far as we have on this, is that he defeats a bunch of Philistines. Couple little notes along our way. Shamgar's story of killing 600 Philistines is very similar in some ways to Samson's killing of I don't know what the number, but a large number of Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. If you remember that story from Samson. There is another parallel that the story brings out, and that's a parallel between how Ehud and it's a parallel between Joab and Ehud, and how Joab later deals with Amasa. Amasa was he was the war chief of the northern army of Saul's army, and Joab was David's commander in chief. Now Amasa had been given a pardon by King David, and nothing was to happen to him. He was supposed to go on and back to live the rest of his life in a peaceful way. And Joab, who had a thing about Amasa because Amasa had killed Joab's brother in a previous conflict, and so this was a retribution in some ways. And Joab entices Amasa back, or he encourages Amasa to meet him at a place, and Joab kills him by driving a sword into his belly. And so there's a similarity in these two stories in how this has taken place. And that's because we are also supposed to see a similarity in some ways between the story of Ehud and Benjamin and the story of Othniel and Judah. And we're supposed to also see the similarities between the story of Saul from the tribe of Benjamin and the story of David from the tribe of Judah. There are parallels in these two stories where they actually are aligned in some ways. And whether that's an intentional or not, I do not know. Whether the stories that were written in 2 Samuel is where we get the story of Joab and Amasa. If those are supposed to be written as a parallel to Othniel and Ehud, it is an interesting parallel. Or whether the story of Ehud and the story of Ehud is a pre-reflection of the story of David, because they were compiled around the same time. We will never know. But it is just an interesting parallel. And you can see it if you look carefully. You can see that there are alignments of these two stories that are purposeful. In a lot of ways, the language is also the same. Saul is carrying a double-edged sword. We find this, just so you are aware of it, it's in the 20th chapter of 2 Samuel is where you'll find the Joab Amasa story that I'm referring to. Anyway, that is the class for today. It's a little shorter than usual, but I don't want to move on into the next chapter. The next chapter is chapter 4, and it'll be lesson 4, and we will meet Deborah. And so that is exciting, and I want you to be prepared for that, so I want you to read chapter 4. And then the following week, lesson 5 will be on chapter 5, which is the Song of Deborah. And so be prepared for that, and I look forward to hearing from you. I have received feedback from you, so email me. Those of you who are receiving the notification by email that this is out there, please email me with questions or with your own thoughts. I would really appreciate that. It helps me. And I appreciate the feedback I have received. Anita, I love it when you write to me. Please write some more. It does help me focus my thoughts, since I don't get the feedback, the immediate feedback of having you all in the same classroom with me. So, may God bless you and keep you along your way. May God watch out for you in everything that you do. Stay safe, stay well, and be at peace. Shalom.